Okay, guys, now that we've covered everything we've covered so far, we're going to get into some of the instruments in Ableton. So, starting off, we have the analog, which is an analog emulator synth. This is just going to sound like your classic analog synths that you would, get from Guitar Center or wherever you get your synths. This is what it sounds like, the default patch. Pretty standard. A lot of the presets will probably remind you of some 80s music. All the basses there. Really classic sounds in there. Some 8-bit stuff too. So yeah, some really useful stuff in there depending on what kind of music you're making. Analog is a great synth. Reminder too, you can also load in the default patch to whatever synth or sound that you're working with just by clicking the synth just like that. That'll load in the default patch. Next is collision. Collision is most closely resembles corpus, the audio effect, where instead of using the tones to add something to your original source sound, this is the sound entirely. So this is what collision sounds like on its own. A couple of presets. It's just, they're basically just based on different materials. You can go through and look at marimba, string, plate, pipe, tube. Some of these different materials when they're it sounds like when they're hit with something, that's the kind of tone that they're making. So these are all different presets made out of that. You can kind of hear the different qualities, as we cycle through different presets. So that's collision. Next one is the drum rack. And the drum rack is just going to come in empty like this. There aren't any presets for it. We can find those presets in here actually. So these are all different drum kits with different processing. So when I load one in, just by double clicking, it'll show that like all of these different parameters and different channels here based on the original drum kit. So that is the drum kit. Here is electric. Electric's kind of it's kind of a mix between analog and the collision. You can kind of hear it sounds like a synthesizer, but it's a little bit dampened. A lot of the presets are a little bit limited. They're not really complex. It's really straightforward type synth. We're not going to go over the external instruments today. So we'll move on to Impulse here. Impulse is another type of drum rack. It's more simplified drum rack. Think of it like the difference between sampler and simpler, which we'll get into a little bit later. This is kind of just like a pared down version of the drum rack. A couple of presets they have here. Pretty straightforward. So an instrument rack is basically what this is right here. So if we have multiple instruments on the same channel, like right here, like let's take a look at this, and we have different effects on here, it's going to come in as an instrument rack rather than just one single instrument. And these are all organized by different types. They're all like a hodgepodge of different synthesizers that we that we're all looking at. Like this one's tension, which is down here. But I mean, in the instrument rack folder, you'll find every Ableton instrument all rolled into that specific folder. So next one is Operator. Operator is Ableton's FM synthesizer. And if you're not familiar with FM synthesis, we're not going to get too into how it works today. But basically what happens is one signal, like the bass signal, goes into the next signal, and then into the next signal, and then into the next signal, and you can shape it to make it sound like all kinds of different ways. Right here we can switch the routing, so it's so maybe the bass signal only goes in here, then it splits evenly into these two guys, or a multitude of different types that you can choose from. So let's take a look at some of these presets here. You can get pretty complex. A lot of FM synthesis is used today in dubstep through Serum and Massive, but this is a much more simplified form of FM synthesis. Okay, now we're going to get into the sampler and the simpler. These are both two versions of essentially the same thing, just one gives you a lot more control than the other one does. But on the flip side, one's a lot easier to use than the other one. So let's pull this one up here. This is, so it basically takes a source sound, maybe like a sample from Splice or one of your sample packs, and you load it in here, and then you can control it using different parameters. We have our pitch and oscillator menu, then we have our global menu, which controls the quality of how the sample responds when it's triggered. And we have modulation, and then a MIDI menu. These are all it gives you a ton of control with the sampler. On the flip side, we have the simpler, which is like I said, a really pared down version of the sampler. So we just have that. We only have two menus. We have the sample, and then we have the control. So I like to use this one a lot more, mostly because I don't really get into sampling in MIDI that deep. But like I've said before, if you've got different ways of production, this is going using the sampler. Not gonna yell at you. So those are the two differences. We aren't going to get too in depth on how those work today, maybe for another video. Here we have tension, and tension is our it's sort of like a string emulator or an instrument. If we play it, the default preset, it sounds like this. Sounds kind of like a guitar, right? We can go through a couple of different presets. You can definitely tell that this is a string plugin. I mean, you could go through all of these presets and try to find which best fits your project, but I gotta be honest, I haven't used this one too much. So, okay, and then the last one is Wavetable, and we have an entire course on the Academy site on Wavetable that I did, and I go in depth on how this thing works and what it does. It's a really, really great synth. It's brand new in Ableton 10. It's definitely something you want to take a look at. Let's take a look at some of these presets here. You can definitely tell in comparison with all the rest of these synths, this one's way more complex. It gives you, and I mean, it's not even complex in that it's hard to use. It just gives you a lot more complex sounds, and that's because it allows us to affect the wavetable differently, and we get to use a little bit of FM synthesis, like going off of the two oscillators and choosing different wavetables, so we can get all kinds of crazy sounds, and comes with a filter and modulation and all that stuff. So it's really useful. So, all right, guys, that's about it for the Ableton instruments. I'll see you guys in the video for the Ableton effects.